Right, live.
All right, good evening, guys, and welcome back from Christmas break and the start of a new year, but same study for us. As a reminder, we have a whole couple weeks ahead of us here until we hit eventually May. Our final day is going to be at that, I believe it's that first Monday in May is going to be our sharing night, which I know it's early to start talking about now, but keep it in your mind. It's definitely a time that it's just powerful to see how people have grown and learned about God in the past year. And so pencil that in on your calendars, be thinking about it. It's never too early to be thinking about it because given opportunities for distraction and other activities, it's definitely easy to be pulled away. We see that even in our lesson tonight with there's temptations and anger and other distractions that are pulling things and people's attentions away from where they should be. I hope everyone had a good opportunity to have time to celebrate the birth of Christ and to welcome in the new year. And I'm excited to be back in this study here with you guys tonight. As we look at starting back in our study here, we jump right back into Esther. And when trying to figure out a way to best communicate the drama, the highs and the lows, and the dramatic reveals of the story of Esther, the first thing that came to my mind was trying to give a summary of the soap opera days of our lives. And I quickly realized I had to scrap that because we don't have the time to even properly scratch the surface of the plot twists and dramatic reveals of that, much less any soap opera. So instead, we're going to go ahead and dive straight into the real thing itself and look at the truth and the courage of Esther and the consequences of the anger of Haman tonight. Before our break for Christmas, we started the book of Esther. As a quick recap, let's review some of the highlights from the first two chapters, just to make sure that we remember where the stage is set right now. King Xerxes of Persia threw a half-year-long gala to flaunt his wealth and his power, and the gala ended with a week-long rager where wine never ceased flowing, but ended on a sour note when Queen Vashti refused to appear before the drunken crowd of men. Deposing his queen, the king ordered a search for a new queen and rounded up virgins from across his kingdom. Esther, a Jew raised by her cousin Mordecai, who frequented the king's gate, won the attention of the king and was made the new queen. One additional key detail for us to remember that we'll circle back to here later tonight is that Mordecai overheard a plot to assassinate the king and reported the plot to the king. The details of Mordecai saving the king were recorded in the annals of the kingdom and shelved. We will discover tonight that the kingdom of Persia was no stranger to plots just like that assassination plot that Mordecai foiled. And so tonight we're going to look at chapters 3 through 7 of Esther over the course of 3 different divisions. Our first one is the plot covering Esther chapter 3, and then the plan covering Esther chapter 4, and then finally we're going to have the execution covering chapter 5 through 7. So I encourage you guys to open up your Bibles to follow along as we go through Esther chapter 3 through 7, and we're going to dive right into the plot. So as we start our passage tonight in Esther 3, we will be pretty much diving straight into the plotting that sets up the conflict for the rest of our story tonight. Sometime after Esther is installed as queen and Mordecai foiled the assassination plot, the king in verse 1 honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. Haman was given great power in the kingdom of Persia, below only the king himself. We've seen something similar happen already in our study this year with Daniel being given great power and honor in the kingdom of Babylon. However, with Daniel, this elevation was due to Daniel's wisdom and his solid character. With Haman, we are not told why he was elevated, but with how we see Haman respond throughout the book of Esther, it seems more likely that scheming and ambition rather than wisdom and integrity were involved in his ascension. After Haman was elevated, the king commanded the royal officials at the gate to bow to honor his new second in command. All the officials did so, except for Esther's cousin Mordecai. We are not told why Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. The royal officials themselves queried Mordecai, and yet he continued to refuse to comply. All that was found out was that Mordecai was a Jew. Until our study this year, I always assumed that it was simply Mordecai refusing to bow because he was a Jew, and bowing to Haman included worship as well. And God commands his people to put no other gods before him, to not worship any but the one true God. However, bowing to honor the king or another official falls into a civil matter, and we are called to obey earthly governments while serving God's law first. Potentially, Mordecai refused to bow because Haman was an Amalekite, specifically from the line of Agag. The Amalekites were longtime enemies of Israel, attacking them when they still wandered in the wilderness. God, through the prophet Samuel, ordered King Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. But Saul failed to fully comply, and because of his failure, the kingdom of Israel was ripped away from Saul and given to David. It's possible that Mordecai refused to honor someone who Mordecai knew shouldn't exist if Saul had obeyed God, and Haman being alive was a reminder of the failure of Israel's first king. But this is just a theory and conjecture. It could also be that Mordecai didn't like the man and stubbornly refused to bow to honor the man that the king had elevated. Regardless, Mordecai's refusal to bow did have consequences. In verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. High emotions seemed to run rampant in those in power in Persia. Haman went beyond annoyance, beyond displeasure, and straight into pure killing rage. Haman's response to someone refusing to kneel was to demand their instant death. But when Haman found out Mordecai was a Jew, in his rage, he, verse 6, looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. This shows us the impact of succumbing to rage. Our level of rationality completely leaves us. Satan takes advantage of our rage to fight against God. Satan is a master deceiver. His native language is lies. He hypes up and promotes evil in this world. He understands our sinful appetites, our selfish desires, and he seeks to exploit our sinful brokenness to accomplish his own dark and evil schemes. Satan and his demons oppose God. He holds an evil power that cannot and should not be ignored. And here we see a plot of evil hatched that attacks God's people, attempting to wipe out the Jews to prevent the prophesied Messiah from being born to save the earth. How thankful should we be that Satan's power cannot and does not compare to God's power? That God's plans cannot be thwarted, cannot be halted. We will see God's power at work throughout these remaining chapters of Esther. God worked to preserve and save his people then, just as he works to save and preserve his children today. In his rage, Haman hatched a plan to wipe the Jews off the face of the earth. But to get started on his plan, he wanted to know what would be the most auspicious day, and so he cast lots, also called Pur. The lots picked a day almost a full year away, giving plenty of time for everything that was to come to unfold. Even in this, God was protecting his people. Haman took the selected day and went to the king to further his plan to wipe away the Jews. He told the king a mixture of truth, half-truth, and lies about the Jews in order to secure his plot. He truthfully stated in verse 8 that the Jews keep themselves separate. And while the Jews do have their own customs, it's a half-truth to claim that they are different from those of all other people. They are still human. Add in a flat-out lie that they do not obey the king's laws, which there is no proof given. And Haman has painted a horrible picture of Mordecai's people. This is the picture that Haman uses to tell the king that it is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. And so Haman pleads with the king to issue a decree to destroy these people and offers a bribe that would have been worth about 2/3 of the income of the kingdom in order to do so. Haman is willing to give anything to see the people of Mordecai be utterly destroyed. The king, who we've seen be easily influenced by his advisors in the past, simply hands over his signet ring to Haman and says to do whatever you want, to, in verse 11, do with the people as you please. The signet ring of the king, the object used to prove you are the king and create irrefutable laws, is just casually handed over to Haman to do whatever he wants to a people that he wants to destroy. As well, the king doesn't even force Haman to pay for this privilege either. And Haman goes all out in destroying the Jews. Using the date selected by his pur, he has proclamations made for the entire kingdom, written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring, that, in verse 13 state, destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. This proclamation is not simply informative, as it is sealed with the signet ring of the king. It is both law and an order. The days of the Jews were numbered. They would all be killed at the end of the year, and the possessions taken as plunder. This upcoming crisis was met by bewilderment in the capital city as people processed this coming eradication of the Jews. Meanwhile, what did the king do? He did what he did best and drank. It certainly appears that Haman's evil plot was born out of prideful rage, that it was going to wipe God's people off the face of the earth. And that brings us to our first principle, that Satan uses our anger and rage to blind us to the truth and power of God. Satan uses our anger and rage to blind us to the truth and power of God. We get to see the full impact of Haman's prideful rage in the order to completely destroy all the Jews in the Persian kingdom. The offense, Mordecai not bowing, does not match the escalation to wiping a people off the face of the earth. But to Haman, this felt justified. It felt logical. It felt righteous. In his anger, it all made sense. And that is because Satan uses our sinful attitudes to blind us to the truth. When we are living in our sin, our own selfish desires and attitudes are what seem to us to be the correct and justified course of action. Even if all they do is push us further into sinful attitudes and actions. The way of the world, the way of Satan, is to serve ourselves. The world attempts to make sin attractive, highlighting how having it your way brings immediate gratification. But sin is not fulfilling. A life built on a foundation of sin is shaky and unstable at best. How is the world tempting you to compromise your faith by choosing your own desires over what is right? How does knowing that God is stronger than both sin and Satan encourage you to trust in God's plan and purposes? And so as we enter the next chapter, we move on to our next division, the plan, covering chapter 4. So with the plot in place to eradicate the Jews at the end of the year, we now have a massive problem. These notices were sent to the entire kingdom of Persia, an empire that spanned the known world. There would be no mercy given. A national decree to kill and plunder would be enforced. So when Mordecai found out about the decree, he mourned what was coming for his people. He, in verse 1, tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. Presumably, in his mourning for the coming death of his people, he was on his way to make his way to his cousin Esther in the palace. But when he got to the king's gate, he was barred entry because, verse 2, no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. Given what we know of this king's ruling method, I think this shows us a further insight into Xerxes. A man who did not want mourning or bad things near him, a man who gladly gave away his signet ring to a man who wanted to exterminate a people instead of asking questions and getting involved himself. Simply put, a man who only wanted to party it up. As this notice went out, every Jew in the kingdom was mourning, fasting, weeping, and wailing. The king's response to his edict was willful ignorance. He drank while his city mourned. Mordecai and the Jews responded appropriately to the news of this atrocity, mourning and fasting. While not stated, hopefully they were already praying to God about this looming destruction. Esther, who had been isolated and sequestered in the harem, knows nothing about the proclamation to kill the Jews. Again, the palace appears to be almost separate from the actual workings of the kingdom. But when told that Mordecai is waiting to speak with her, but is in sackcloth and barred from entry to the palace, she first tries to get him fresh clothes so he can enter, simply hiding away the signs of mourning, and everything will be okay. You'll be let in. But Mordecai was not willing to stop grieving the impact of Haman's plot, and Esther was trapped in the palace. And so we get a back and forth conversation between the two through Esther's eunuch servants. Mordecai shares about the proclamation to kill all the Jews, signed and sealed by the king, her husband. He also shares that Haman had offered to pay more than half of the nation's GDP in order to make this happen. For Esther, what do you think went through her head? Did this proclamation, granted by her husband to kill her people, shake her, disturb her? Sure, the king did not know that Esther was Jewish, but that doesn't change that at a whim, her husband was willing to be complicit in genocide. So quickly, we can find ourselves surrounded by the evils of this world. For the world has been blinded by sin and considers what is wrong to be right. Only the truth of God can be the light that shows us the path of righteousness. Darkness tries to lead us astray. Mordecai pleaded for Esther to, in verse 8, go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. But Queen Esther was quick to point out the difficulties in the plan that Mordecai was proposing. Anyone who came before the king unsummoned was to, verse 11, be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. As Esther had not been summoned by the king for 30 days, she wasn't sure where she stood in the fickle king's graces. While the lives of her people were already condemned in the coming year, Esther was quick to point out that her life would be immediately on the line if she went before the king to plead unsummoned. This is a legitimate concern, but it is a selfish concern. Esther was worried for her own life. How often do we worry about our own needs, our own security, our own problems, over the crises that are impacting those that are all around us? Mordecai responded back with a chastisement of Esther's selfishness and fear. Verse 13, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. While Esther had kept her heritage secret, one way or another, the truth would come out. It was known now that Mordecai was a Jew. And whether known or not, he was the one who raised her. She was his cousin. People are able to connect those dots. Esther's life was already in danger. Often in our own selfishness, we can be blinded to our actual situation. In addition, Mordecai pointed out that the power of God to deliver his people from danger. For while not mentioning God by name, Mordecai spoke a powerful truth in verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. To me, this reads as faith in God to save his people. Mordecai did not know how the Jews would be delivered, but he believed that God's people would be delivered, that they would be protected and saved from this disaster that loomed. However, Mordecai was connecting the dots of his life and Esther's life, and saw that their lives had been leading to this moment. Is it possible that Esther was made queen in order for God's people to be saved? Mordecai puts this question to phrase in verse 14 superbly. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? God is actively working in the lives of his children. His plan is perfect, and he is in control. God places us where we need to be. He placed Esther where she needed to be in order to help save the Jewish people. And Esther, she took Mordecai's challenge to heart, and in her response committed herself to the salvation of her people. She ordered Mordecai in verse 16, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Wow. Mordecai asked Esther to step up, and she did. First, she asked her people to fast for her. Fasting with a spiritual purpose, most often accompanied with prayer, is removing normal routines of eating in order to focus on our relationship with God. Esther was asking her people to fast in order to help everyone, including herself, focus on what was about to be done. For she was committing herself to go before the king to plead for the lives of her people. She knew she was risking her own death, and she was willing now to do so in order for the chance that her people would be able to be saved from destruction. What an example for us. While she started out looking only out for herself, Esther was willing to sacrifice herself now to do what was right. And that brings us to our second principle. Surrendering to God's plan requires dying to our own selfishness. Surrendering to God's plan requires dying to our own selfishness. We get to see a transformation in Esther in chapter 4 as the plan to save the Israelites is developed. While she starts off worried about the consequences of appearing before the king, she ends the conversation with Mordecai as a warrior, willing to give whatever is required to make sure that her people have a voice. In the process of surrendering herself to God's plan, she had to die to her self-centered desires and instead do what was necessary and do what was right. What she was preparing to do risked her life. But in her developing courage, she was willing to do so in order to try and save her people, to save God's people. As Mordecai pondered, it might have been for this very reason that Esther became queen, for such a time as this. It is not always clear what God's plan is for us, but we can pray for guidance and seek to honor him with our actions. Where has God placed you for such a time as this? Esther's choice to stand for her people, even if she perished, was a selfless choice. She was the queen of an empire at the side of the king. Her every want was attended to, and there was nothing that she lacked. The world is full of comforts, full of distractions. Sin and Satan attempt to seduce us away from the truth and lead us blindly into the darkness of evil. We are born into the darkness and evils of this world. We are born into sin. The evils of this world hold tight to those who remain slaves to sin. Only through Jesus can we experience freedom and know truth. Esther was a Jew. Her people followed the one true God. And while Satan was trying to distract her with comforts, Mordecai helped Esther see that she was being called to stand selflessly for her people. What courageous stand is God calling you to take? And so now we enter our third division, the execution, covering chapter 5 through 7. With the evil plot underway and the plan to seek salvation in place, we now get to the execution of it all. After 3 days of fasting, Esther put on her royal robes, in my mind, like donning her armor. She did not go running into the king's throne room, but instead showed discretion, patience, and bravery as she started to enact her plan. She waited in the hall, where she would have been able to be seen by the king. In a sense, she let herself be found or discovered by the king instead of forcing him to make an immediate decision on whether to extend his scepter under pressure. So when he finally did notice his lovely queen in verse 2, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. Esther's courage and bravery were successful. The king accepted her presence. In fact, the king was pleased to see her, either out of joy at seeing her or possibly because he was able to pick up her distress. He asked her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." The king was offering up to half his kingdom to solve whatever problem or desire his queen was facing. Here was a chance that might have tempted Esther to simply ask for power or for wealth. But she stayed committed to her plan and simply asked the king and Haman to join her in a banquet that was already prepared. After all, the quickest way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Or in the case of King Xerxes, perhaps through his wine. And I believe the queen was wise here. She knew that she would be pleading for what she would be pleading for would be a spectacle if asked in a public setting. But by inviting the king to a private feast, there would be eventually an opportunity to plead her case in a setting where the king could actually consider what was being asked. Oftentimes there is great wisdom in finding a discreet time to discuss an issue that might be complicated to talk about in front of a crowd. At this first banquet, with the wine flowing, once more the king asks about Esther's request and offers up to half the kingdom to provide resolution. Esther stalls once more at this banquet, asking to reveal her request at another banquet the next day. Whether she needed more time to brace herself or wanted to make sure the king was properly lubricated, or for some other reason we are not told. But because of this pause, we get to see an example of the consequences of both unbridled rage and self-serving pride. Both are dangerous, and both are wielded by Haman to his severe detriment. I encourage each of you to take note of the lessons that we can learn from letting anger and pride rule our lives through what remains of Haman's life in our passage. Leaving the private banquet with the king and queen, Haman was still in high spirits. But on his way back home, he crossed paths with Mordecai, who still did not show reverence or fear to Haman. So verse 9, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Not annoyance, not even anger, pure and utter rage at seeing Mordecai, who continued to refuse to show Haman honor. How quickly can our own happiness be ruined by our anger, by our rage? Haman rushed home and vented to his wife and his friends. He bragged about how important he was, about his promotion, about the private banquet with the king and the queen. But in verse 13, we see his heart. All this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Other than one man who refused to bow or cower to him, everything was coming up Haman. But because of letting anger and rage rule his mind, Haman could not enjoy the bounty that was being poured out upon him. Instead, like a fly in the ointment, Mordecai was causing undue distress to Haman. And so even though Mordecai was already a dead man walking, Haman could not let it go. So he took the advice of his friends and his wife to build a 50-foot pole to impale Mordecai on. A preferred method of execution in Persia, impaling on a pole was used to disgrace the deceased, and so a ridiculously high pole showed the extent to which Haman despised Mordecai. His wife and his friends then suggested to him, in verse 14, ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. Who here thinks Haman needs a different set of friends and a serious talk with his wife? I know I do. Unfortunately, it appears that Haman's friends and his wife are well suited for him. And Haman is delighted by this advice and goes about setting it into motion immediately. Anger is a powerful emotion. And when we let it rule us, we are letting sin take control of our lives. Satan loves anger. As stated in Ephesians, it helps give the devil a foothold in our lives. When you are angry, do not sin. Do not be like Haman. Instead, seek peace and seek relief from your anger in God. Instead of acting in anger, go to prayer. Let God's righteousness, not anger, rule your life. We will get to the cost of Haman's anger in a moment, but now in chapter 6, we get to see the cost of his pride. That very night, in verse 1, the king could not sleep, and so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. That's just what I always do when I can't sleep. Have my accomplishments read out loud to me. Though to be fair, it could be that they were so dry that the goal was to help put him to sleep. During this sleepless session, the king was reminded that Mordecai had saved his life by reporting an assassination plot. It was also brought to his attention that nothing was ever done to reward Mordecai for this act of heroism. The king didn't draw the connection that Mordecai was under a death sentence due to the proclamation sealed by his own signet ring, but that seems to track with the engagement level of the king with the goings-on in his empire. Even when figuring out how to reward Mordecai, he needed to seek help. So when the king asks who is in the court that early in the morning, there's only one present at that time, and that man is Haman, who we know is there bright and early to ask the king for permission to impale Mordecai on a pole. But before Haman can make his request, the king asks him in verse 6, what should be done for the man the king delights in to honor? Haman is overjoyed at this thought puzzle, because due to his own pride, he can only see himself as being the one that the king wants to honor. And so in his pride, Haman proposes to treat this hypothetical man as if he were the king himself. Verse 8, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and the horse the king has ridden, for one with a royal crest placed on his head. But Haman's desire for accolades does not stop there. Instead, he adds to have one of the king's most noble princes in verse 9, lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Thinking it is for him, Haman wants to be seen as king for the day. But as we know, the king has other plans. He tells Haman the worst possible news. Do all this for Mordecai the Jew. Verse 10, do not neglect anything that you have recommended. And that part about a noble prince leading the honored man through the street, yeah, that noble prince chosen is Haman, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. That's appropriate for this honor. But that means that Haman was forced to lead Mordecai, the man that he hated, through the streets of Susa, loudly proclaiming, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. For prideful and angry Haman, there could be almost no worse imaginable punishment. And when done, in verse 12, Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and complained to his wife and his friends. Starting to see everything fall apart, his hype men turned to naysayers in verse 13, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin. You cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Perhaps stories of the power of the God of Israel have been spreading, and now, seeing Haman's humiliation, they were all starting to fear consequences for the actions they had taken against the Jews. Pride and anger can cause us to make sinful choices that we will come to regret. No good decisions can be made when pride and anger have control of the steering wheel of our lives. But for Haman, there was no more time to ponder. It was now time for the second banquet with the king and Esther. At this banquet, after serving more wine, the king once more asked in verse 2 of chapter 7, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. The king was eager to satisfy his queen and was caught unawares when the queen answered in verse 3 to grant me my life and spare my people. His queen was revealing that her life and the life of her people were being threatened, that they were in danger. Someone was out to kill the queen. Did Haman yet realize that it was him? Esther elaborated in verse 4, "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." It was because her people were going to be wiped out that she was speaking up. Anything less, even slavery, would have been not worth disturbing the king. But eradication is a harsh sentence. And so the king demands in verse 5 to know who is trying to kill his queen. Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. I know that this statement in the Bible ends in just a simple question mark, but given the forthcoming response of the king to storm out in a rage, I believe that an interrobang, or a combined exclamation and question mark, is also a correct punctuation that could be used here by the king. His anger is building. There was intensity already being showed. And the time for calm has fled. Esther answers the king truthfully and vividly in verse 6. An adversary and enemy. This vile Haman. She pulls no punches. She labels Haman for what he is. Her enemy, her adversary, the man who had created and signed her death warrant. When revealed as a man who had ordered the death of the queen, Haman is terrified. The fruits of his own rage and anger are coming due, just as our sin always has consequences. When told that Haman is behind the plot to kill the queen and her people, the king enters in immense rage and storms off into the garden. So angry that he even leaves his wine behind. Meanwhile, Haman realizes that the king's rage can only mean that Haman is not long for this world. And so Haman turns to the woman he ordered to be killed by his own proclamation and begs for his life. Unfortunately for Haman, as he falls on the queen to beg for his life, the queen re-enters, only to see what seems to be Haman molesting his queen as she lay on a dinner couch. With Haman's life now almost certainly forfeit, a nearby eunuch helpfully volunteers the information that Haman has set up a brand new 50-foot tall impaling pole. In verse 9, he even adds, he set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king, just in case the king needed more help connecting those dots. But he doesn't. He makes the conclusion and makes all those connections finally, and orders, instead of Mordecai, for Haman to be impaled upon the 50-foot pole that Haman himself built. Haman's execution is both swift and painful. Haman truly hoisted by his own petard, to quote Shakespeare. Haman's anger and Haman's pride have deadly consequences for a man who had it all but could not be content. And that brings us to our final principle tonight. Satan cannot overcome God's plans. Satan cannot overcome God's plans. In his anger and his rage and his pride, Haman implemented a plot to kill all the Jews in the Empire of Persia, an act of great evil. This is but one attempt by Satan to strike the heel of the offspring, as foretold in Genesis chapter 3. It was prevented because God preserves his people. Nothing Satan can do could prevent the Messiah from coming. An attempt to wipe God's people off the face of the earth could not succeed because it was against God's plan. God called Esther to stand for her people, to appeal to the king for the sake of her people. And Esther bravely stood for her people, and God stood firmly with her. How is God calling you to stand bravely for him in this sinful world? Now, if you are following along, the instigator of the plan has been executed, but the order to kill the Jews in the month of Adar is still indisputable law. We will be looking further at how God preserves his people next week as we finish up the book of Esther. But trust me, God's plan is fulfilled because God is all-powerful and is perfectly in control. His promises and his plans are always fulfilled. We can trust in his promise of salvation through his Son, Jesus Christ. How does knowing God's plans are fulfilled encourage you to trust in his provision and in his plans for you? Let's close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this clear illustration of the power that you hold and the fact that your plans cannot be stopped, that you preserve your people. We thank you for the salvation that you have promised, for we know that it is available now to us and that it will be upheld. And Lord, we ask you to help each of us to surrender our emotions, to give up our anger, our rage, and our pride, and instead follow you and seek to honor you with how we act. Lord, we cannot do that on our own, but we need you to help change us, to shape our hearts to be like you. Help each of us to surrender to you daily. Amen.